100 years ago, Puget Sound was bustling with steamships that helped deliver people and goods in an age before modern roads were developed in western Washington. Today, those roads are increasingly mucked up with traffic, and the idea of marine highways is again picking up steam. We'll hitch a ride aboard the newest passenger ferry and investigate the possible resurgence of the Mosquito Fleet on this latest Tales of the Sound next. Welcome aboard the Enitai, the newest passenger ferry to ply the waters of Puget Sound. The Enitai is owned and operated by Kitsap Transit, which pilots this 255-passenger bow-loaded vessel right up to the dock at Southworth before turning around and heading back to Seattle again. The journey takes under a half hour. Kitsap Transit won over 52% of voters in 2016 to establish 3 new passenger ferry runs between Seattle and communities on the Kitsap Peninsula, starting with Bremerton in 2017, Kingston in 2018, and Southworth in 2021. Voter approval meant Kitsap residents now pay 0.3% in sales tax on purchases in the county. Leaders said it was time to look to the water as a way to ease traffic congestion and create new, faster ways to cross the Sound. They needed only to look to the past to find an era when traveling by passenger ship was the dominant way to get around the region. At the time Washington became a state in 1889, Puget Sound was already a marine highway, bustling with ships hauling lumber and other goods. Following the example of the Salish tribes, settlers here found it was far easier to travel by boat than through primitive roads and thick evergreen forests. What started with rowboats journeying for supplies became a booming business. Starting just before the Civil War, the Mosquito Fleet grew to some 1,000 vessels. They even carried livestock, shoving cows off the ends of boats where they were herded through the tidelands. A key catalyst for the fleet of private vessels was the advent of steam power, which used wood and then coal and finally oil to heat water to create steam to turn a piston. The steamers would deliver passengers dock to dock along the shoreline, carefully navigating the tides to avoid peril. The vessels ran south to Olympia and to Shelton, west along Hood Canal all the way to Union, and north all the way to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The network was the most intricate in the early 20th century. They would play an integral role in the settling of Ralph Munro's Scottish grandparents. Growing up on Crystal Springs on the southeast corner of Bainbridge Island, Munro's father each day took a vessel called the Carlisle II and other ferries to the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, where he worked through 2 world wars.
When my dad and his brothers and sisters were born, by the time they came to go to high school, there was really no decent roads across the island or transportation in the early 1900s, so they took the boat to Seattle, and it took a variety of boats. There was one that came down the west side of Bainbridge that they could catch at the float there in front of the place, at later the dock, and there was another that came down from Silverdale, and if you took the rowboat, they'd stop for you in Rich Passage, and you could jump aboard. And they all went to Coleman Dock in Seattle, the same dock that ferries go to today. And then they caught the streetcar up to the foot of Queen Anne Hill and caught the counterbalance up to high school. After the war, there was a little car ferry that went from Point White into Bremerton. But then after the bridge was built at Agate Pass, then we rode on this boat, the Carlisle. And the Carlisle ran service twice a day, and then on shopping days, they ran a 3rd boat at noon, so you could come into Bremerton and shop and then go home on the 5 o'clock boat.
But with the wildly popular automobile and roads that were paved to carry cars, little ferries on Puget Sound largely ground to a halt. Amid the prospect of soaring fares and striking workers, car ferries came under state ownership in 1951 and continue to run on routes like this one from Bremerton to Seattle. At that time, state leaders did not believe they'd be in the business of ferries for long, for engineers were dreaming up a network of highways that would crisscross Puget Sound. But those dreams still have yet to materialize. The state kept a limited passenger-only ferry service going between places like Vashon Island and Bremerton in the latter half of the 20th century. But budget cuts and concerns about shoreline damage from the wake ended those final runs. The state decided it was time to get out of the passenger-only ferry business altogether. But there was one Mosquito Fleet vessel that, through it all, not only survived, but kept running on most days of the week, every half an hour. Built in 1917 in Bellingham as a steamship, the Carlisle II is today likely the country's longest continually operating vessel of commerce. The 65-foot wooden hull boat now runs with a brand new diesel fuel engine. Kitsap Transit spent $1.3 million to keep the boat running as a backup on the Port Orchard to Bremerton route. While roads made commutes in many cases easier, the short sailing across Sinclair Inlet next to the traffic-snarled journey through Gorst just kept making sense.
We just went through a major overhaul. So we brought the vessel up to Port Townsend at Haven Boat Works, and they spent about 4.5 months completely rebuilding the boat, replacing wood, repowering the vessel with a new engine, new generator, giving it a complete facelift and extending the life of the vessel. It's part of the original Mosquito Fleet vessels. It's the longest continuously operated Mosquito Fleet vessel that's still in revenue service.
These days, now that Kitsap Transit is back in the fast ferry business, it's beginning to look like a return to the Mosquito Fleet all over again. But the cause today are congested roadways, rather than they were in the early 20th century when there were no roads at all.
Kitsap Transit has been kind of what people are looking at on how to do it and who to talk to if you want to do it. We've got the PSRC that just did a feasibility study for all these different locations to run passenger-only ferry service. There's tons of potential to be able to run service from, say, Island County or even Olympia or Tacoma to run into downtown Seattle. The biggest hurdle that we have is there's only one slip in Seattle currently that we can pull into. So Kitsap Transit's also working on doing a feasibility study for a regional transit ferry hub in downtown Seattle on the waterfront. The folks that lived in downtown Seattle and would walk to their job, they now can buy a house here in the Kitsap Peninsula, take a bus and still walk to the ferry and then do the same commute in only a half hour or 40 minutes if they're taking a bus. So it's really opened up the housing market here in Kitsap. Folks want to move here. It's a little bit more affordable to live here on the Kitsap Peninsula. And if they know they've got reliable transportation to and from that's fast, they don't have to spend their whole day commuting, that's what folks are looking for.
With this fast ferry, it's been so convenient to catch 6:45, get over here on the earlier side of that 7:20, catch the right bus to get up to work. It's so much more convenient, especially going home. So it's getting me time in the evenings now to actually go ride my bike a little bit.
Traffic on I-5 continues to be a nightmare for many commuters. Alternatives like Sound Transit's light rail promises connections between places like Everett and Tacoma, but those connections won't be available to commuters until around 2040 or so.
I used to tease when I was Secretary of State, I used to tease the guys from the Department of Transportation, and I'd ask them, how come my father could get to Seattle faster in 1916 than he could today by boat? But, you know, it wasn't a fair question because he was catching the boat in front of his house and going straight in. So many nights I've come across Puget Sound, and Puget Sound would be flat, calm, and I look up at the freeways are dead stop. And I'm saying to myself, oh, I wish I had a boat to go back to Olympia or back to wherever. You know.
The state legislature requested a study of other Mosquito Fleet-like routes, including Tacoma and Gig Harbor to Seattle, as well as Bellingham to the San Juans and routes across Lake Washington. These new fast ferries aren't just stocked with diesel fuel anymore. Kitsap Transit's primary Bremerton to Port Orchard run is actually a hybrid electric and runs on batteries for much of its crossings. That move has saved the agency about 60% in fuels in an era of climate crisis. With millions more in grant funding, Kitsap Transit is now planning a fully battery-powered vessel that will run between Seattle and Bremerton using a hydrofoil system. The state ferry system too is looking for ways at reducing its carbon footprint. Already in the works is a new Olympic-class vessel that will have battery backup to go with a diesel engine. This will allow it to cross on those batteries alone, as well as plug in when it gets to the terminals on each side. Perhaps someday drones will simply fly us to different points on Puget Sound. But people also once thought that big concrete highways would go from places like Vashon and Bainbridge Island, and that has never happened. So, as anachronistic as it may seem, these ferries keep on sailing. We hope you have enjoyed this latest episode of Tales of the Sound. Drop me some feedback at josh.farley@kitsapsun.com. We'll see you next time.